A Green Beret captain stood at the Nui Dat airstrip in March 1968, watching something that made him laugh out loud. Australian SAS soldiers were taking hacksaws to their rifles, literally sawing off the barrels of perfectly good military weapons in a dusty maintenance shed. To the Americans who had just arrived in Vietnam, men who prided themselves on firepower and technology, it looked like complete insanity. The captain turned to his squad and said, loud enough for the Australians to hear, "Look at those idiots! They won't last a week." He was wrong, dead wrong, because 6 hours later, that same captain wasn't laughing. He was pinned down in a jungle firefight, his squad taking casualties, screaming into his radio for someone, anyone, to pull them out. And the only people coming to save him were those idiots with the sawed-off guns. But what happened next didn't just save his life. It exposed a fundamental truth that the Pentagon had been refusing to acknowledge for 3 years. Two Allied forces were fighting the same war in completely different ways, and only one of those ways was working. This is the story of a tactical philosophy clash that would force American special operations to completely rethink how jungle warfare should be fought. A clash between firepower and patience, between technology and adaptation, between conventional warfare and something the enemy had never encountered before. The numbers told a story that nobody in Washington wanted to hear. Australian SAS patrols in Puak Tui province were achieving kill ratios that seemed mathematically impossible. 1 friendly casualty for every 500 enemy eliminated. Some sources cite ratios as high as 30-1. American units conducting identical missions in adjacent sectors were averaging 1-12. This wasn't a marginal difference. This was the gap between total tactical dominance and grinding attrition. Two forces from Allied nations, equipped with similar weapons, facing the same enemy in the same terrain, producing results so different they appeared to be fighting completely separate wars. And the more American observers looked at how the Australians operated, the more confused they became. Everything the Australians did violated every principle of American military doctrine. They moved slower, they carried less, they made themselves smell worse. They modified their weapons in ways that reduced their technical capabilities. They operated in units so small that conventional military thinking considered them dangerously vulnerable. Yet, they were the only Western force in Vietnam that the Viet Cong genuinely feared. The enemy had a specific name for them, Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts. Understanding why requires going back to the fundamental assumptions that shaped how each force approached the war. American military doctrine in the 1960s emerged from victories in World War II and Korea, wars won through industrial supremacy and overwhelming firepower. The philosophy was straightforward. Superior technology plus superior resources equals inevitable victory. Find the enemy, fix them in position, and destroy them with artillery, air power, and massed infantry. It was a doctrine built for conventional warfare between nation-states with clear front lines and defined objectives. Vietnam had neither. General William Westmoreland's strategy of attrition, officially termed search and destroy, reflected this conventional thinking applied to an unconventional war. American forces would use their mobility advantages to locate enemy units, use their firepower advantages to engage them, use their technological advantages to ensure overwhelming victory in each engagement, repeat until enemy casualties exceeded their ability to replace losses. The math seemed sound. The United States could drop more bombs, fire more artillery rounds, and deploy more troops than North Vietnam could possibly sustain against. But this approach contained a fatal assumption. It assumed the enemy would cooperate by engaging American forces when and where those forces wanted to fight. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army understood something that American planners either missed or chose to ignore. In guerrilla warfare, the side that controls when and where fighting occurs holds the decisive advantage. They had studied American tactics for years before the 1st Marine Battalions came ashore at Da Nang. They knew Americans moved in large units that made noise. They knew Americans relied on helicopter insertions that announced their presence from kilometers away. They knew Americans favored immediate escalation to heavy fire support. Most importantly, they knew Americans measured success in body counts and territory seized, neither of which mattered in a war with no front lines. Against such an enemy, the Vietnamese Communists developed a simple counter-strategy: avoid engagement unless conditions favored them. When forced to engage, inflict maximum casualties quickly, and withdraw before American firepower could be brought to bear. Use the jungle itself as both weapon and sanctuary. Wait. The massive search and destroy operations that characterized American ground strategy produced spectacular statistics and modest strategic results. Operation Junction City in early 1967 involved 22 American battalions and 4 South Vietnamese battalions supported by massive air and artillery firepower. Over 2 months, it yielded an average of approximately 33 enemy killed per day. Such losses were manageable for an opponent that could field tens of thousands of determined fighters and replace them from a population of millions. The operation cleared territory that the Viet Cong simply reoccupied after American forces moved on. American tactical methods in the field reflected these strategic assumptions. Patrols moved at 2 to 3 kilometers per day, considered an acceptable balance between caution and operational tempo. Units traveled in platoon or company strength, rarely smaller. Helicopter insertions provided rapid mobility, but announced presence to every enemy listening post within audible range. Standard American uniforms, equipment, and hygiene protocols meant soldiers could be identified as American from hundreds of meters away by smell alone. When contact occurred, doctrine called for immediate escalation, suppressive fire, and calling in artillery or air support. These methods worked against conventional armies. They had crushed the Wehrmacht across Europe, pushed Chinese forces back in Korea, and demonstrated American military supremacy in dozens of smaller conflicts. But in the triple canopy jungles of Vietnam, against an enemy that chose its battles carefully and refused to fight on American terms, they produced grinding attrition without decisive results. Then there were the Australians. The Australian military presence in Vietnam was modest by American standards. Never more than 8,000 troops deployed at peak compared to over 500,000 Americans. The Australian commitment centered on the 1st Australian Task Force, established in Phuoc Tuy Province in April 1966. Given their own tactical area of responsibility under overall American operational control, the Australians were allowed to, in the words of military historians, fight their own tactical war. That war looked nothing like the American version. Australian tactical doctrine emerged from fundamentally different historical experiences. Where American forces had won wars through industrial superiority, Australian forces had spent a century fighting on the margins of empire. The Boer War in South Africa, the Malayan emergency fighting communist insurgents, the Indonesian confrontation in Borneo. In each conflict, Australian forces operated with limited resources against enemies who couldn't be defeated through firepower alone because there wasn't overwhelming firepower available. They learned patience, fieldcraft, and that psychological operations could achieve results that artillery couldn't. Most critically, Australian forces had just spent years fighting communist insurgents in Malaysia, gaining extensive experience in exactly the kind of jungle warfare now required in Vietnam. According to historical accounts, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk admitted at a meeting in Canberra in May 1962 that American armed forces knew little about jungle warfare. Australian advisors were initially sent to Vietnam specifically because of their expertise in jungle combat tactics. When the first Australian task force established its base at Nui Dat, it operated under different assumptions than American forces. The Australians weren't trying to kill their way to victory through superior firepower. They were trying to achieve psychological dominance over a defined area through superior fieldcraft. This required completely different methods. Within the Australian task force operated a unit so small it barely registered on American organizational charts, the Special Air Service Regiment. 3 squadrons rotating through Vietnam, never more than 150 men in country at any given time. Officially designated as reconnaissance, actually functioning as something far more specialized. The Americans who first observed SAS operations couldn't understand what they were seeing. It violated every principle they'd been taught. The smell was the first shock. An American intelligence officer who visited the Australian base at Nui Dat in March 1968 later reported being hit by an odor so intense he initially assumed it indicated logistics failure or disciplinary breakdown. The smell suggested decomposition, stagnant water, and what his brain could only process as profound human neglect. Surely no professional military would permit soldiers to reach such a state of filth voluntarily. He approached an Australian lieutenant to offer assistance with hygiene supplies. The Australian's response carried an edge the American would remember decades later. The smell wasn't failure, it was doctrine, and it was the reason Australian soldiers came home alive while Americans came home in body bags. Every American soldier in Vietnam received a standard field hygiene kit: soap, deodorant, shaving cream, toothpaste, insect repellent. The United States Army considered personal cleanliness essential for discipline and morale. Clean soldiers were professional soldiers. This logic had governed American military thinking since the trenches of France in World War I. The Viet Cong had learned to exploit it ruthlessly. Captured enemy fighters confirmed in interrogation after interrogation that American patrols could be detected by smell from over 500 meters away. The chemical signature of American hygiene products was completely alien to the jungle environment. Deodorant created scent trails that lingered for hours in humid air. Insect repellent contained compounds detectable at extreme distances. American cigarettes, with their distinctive Virginia tobacco, announced patrol positions to any enemy scout within a kilometer. Australian SAS troopers eliminated every chemical marker. 2 weeks before any patrol, they stopped using soap entirely. They abandoned deodorant, shaving cream, commercial toothpaste. They switched from American cigarettes to local tobacco, or quit smoking completely. They ate indigenous food, including fermented fish sauce that altered their body chemistry. By insertion day, they smelled exactly like the jungle itself, like rot, mud, and vegetable decay. The tactical results were documented in classified reports that American commanders found difficult to process. Viet Cong patrols routinely passed within meters of concealed Australian positions without detecting anything unusual. In one verified incident from November 1967, an enemy fighter actually stepped on an Australian trooper's boot while walking along a trail at night. The Viet Cong soldier looked down, registered nothing but jungle debris, and continued walking. The Australian trooper did not move, did not react, did not breathe visibly for the entire encounter. The enemy soldier never knew he had placed his foot on a human being who could have killed him instantly. But the smell doctrine was only the beginning. The weapons modifications disturbed American ordnance specialists even more. The American intelligence officer examining Australian weapons at Nui Dat noticed something immediately wrong. The barrels were too short. The proportions were off. When he looked closer, he discovered someone had taken a hacksaw to precision military weapons and removed approximately 15 centimeters from the barrel. This wasn't battlefield damage. This was deliberate modification performed in the Australian Armoury. The standard Australian service rifle was the L1A1 self-loading rifle, a variant of the legendary FNFAL. It was one of the finest battle rifles ever manufactured, accurate to 400 meters, reliable in adverse conditions, respected by militaries worldwide. American ordnance officers considered it roughly equivalent to their own M14. The Australians were destroying it, or so it appeared to American observers. They cut the barrels short. They removed the flash suppressors. They welded crude forward grips made from scrap metal or carved hardwood. The resulting weapon looked like something a desperate partisan might assemble in an occupied country, not standard equipment for elite special operations soldiers. American weapons specialists who examined these modifications were appalled. They had ruined the ballistics. They had reduced effective range by at least 60%. They had created something loud, inaccurate, and unprofessional. The Australians called it the bitch, and it was perfectly designed for the environment where it would actually be used. In the Vietnamese jungle, average visibility was 10 to 15 meters, not 100 meters, not 400 meters, 15 meters maximum. A rifle accurate to 400 meters was useless when you couldn't see past 15. Worse, full-length barrels constantly snagged on vines, bamboo, and undergrowth. Every snag required stopping, freeing the weapon, and resuming movement. Every stop created noise. Every noise could mean detection. The shortened barrel eliminated snags. The bitch slid through vegetation like water. The loss of long-range accuracy was irrelevant because there was no long range. And the 7.62 millimeter round, even from a shortened barrel, delivered stopping power at close range that the American 5.56 millimeter M16 simply couldn't match. The M16 fired a smaller, faster round designed for accuracy at extended ranges. In close quarters, jungle combat, it had a tendency to wound rather than instantly stop. The round passed through human tissue so quickly that enemy fighters sometimes continued advancing for several seconds before collapsing. The 7.62 round from the bitch did not wound at 15 meters. It ended threats immediately, but the weapons were only part of the equipment puzzle. The footwear confused American observers even more profoundly. Several Australian troopers preparing for patrol were wearing sandals. Not military boots, sandals. Specifically, sandals made from old automobile tires, with straps cut from inner tubes. The American officer recognized them immediately. They were Ho Chi Minh sandals, standard Viet Cong footwear manufactured throughout North Vietnam. Why were Australian soldiers wearing enemy footwear? The answer revealed a level of tactical sophistication that American doctrine had never contemplated. Tracking was one of the primary methods the Viet Cong used to locate and pursue enemy patrols. Every boot left distinctive impressions. American jungle boots had specific tread patterns recognizable to any experienced tracker. A Viet Cong scout who found American boot prints knew exactly what he was following and could estimate numbers, direction, and approximate time since passage. By wearing captured Ho Chi Minh sandals, Australian patrols left tracks indistinguishable from Viet Cong movement. A tracker who found these prints would assume he was following friendly forces. He would not raise alarm. He would not call for ambush teams. He might even walk directly into the Australian patrol, believing he was meeting comrades. This was not the only counter-tracking technique the Australians employed. They walked in streams when possible, leaving no prints at all. They stepped on roots and rocks rather than soft earth. When crossing muddy areas, the last man in the patrol would brush out tracks using branches. These methods added significant time to movement, but they made Australian patrols effectively impossible to follow. The Viet Cong, who had tracked French colonial forces for years, who had tracked South Vietnamese army units with ease, who tracked American patrols almost at will, could not track the Australians. The hunters found themselves unable to locate their prey. Perhaps most significantly, American observers noticed something different about Australian attitudes that went beyond tactics and equipment. It concerned how they referred to their enemy. American soldiers used a variety of terms for Viet Cong fighters: Charlie, Victor Charles, Gooks, Dinks, Slopes. The terminology ranged from neutral military brevity to outright racial contempt. The underlying assumption was consistent. The enemy was inferior, primitive, technologically backwards, to be destroyed through superior American firepower. The Australians called them Mr. Charles. This was not sarcasm or irony. This was genuine respect expressed through formal address. Australian briefings referred to enemy capabilities with careful attention to detail. Enemy tactics were studied rather than dismissed. Enemy successes were analyzed for lessons rather than attributed to luck or American errors. The Australians did not hate their enemy. They respected him as a dangerous opponent who had been fighting in these jungles for decades and had developed capabilities that deserved serious attention. This respect had direct tactical consequences. American patrols often walked into situations believing their technological superiority would carry the day. Australian patrols assumed nothing and prepared for everything. American soldiers sometimes died because they underestimated enemy capability. Australian soldiers survived because they never did. But the single most important difference, the element that drove American observers to the edge of professional fury, was movement speed. The United States military believed in speed, aggression, and firepower. These principles had won World War II. They had held Korea. They made America the dominant military power on Earth. When American Special Operations units conducted long-range reconnaissance in Vietnam, they moved at 2 to 3 kilometers per day. This was considered an acceptable balance between caution and urgency. Australian SAS patrols moved at 100 to 200 meters per hour. When American observers first heard this figure, they assumed translation error or miscommunication. 100 meters per hour meant covering 1 kilometer required an entire day. A 5-kilometer mission would take nearly a week. This seemed not merely slow, but operationally absurd. How could anyone accomplish anything moving that slowly? The Australians offered a demonstration. What American observers witnessed in 30 minutes, destroyed their understanding of infantry movement. 4 Australian troopers entered jungle terrain 500 meters from the Nui Dat perimeter. The point man took a single step, placing his foot with surgical precision on a spot that would support weight without compression or sound. Then the entire patrol froze. Complete stillness. Not reduced movement, zero movement. They remained frozen for 4 minutes. During those 4 minutes, American observers watched them, scanning their surroundings, using only their eyes, never turning their heads. They watched them, testing the air with subtle nostril movements, reading scent the way predators read prey. They watched their fingers make microscopic adjustments on their weapons, preparing for instant action while appearing completely inert. They watched them, listening with an intensity that seemed almost supernatural, processing every sound the jungle produced. After 4 minutes, another step, another freeze, another 4 minutes of absolute stillness. In 30 minutes, the patrol covered approximately 50 meters. The American observers stood 15 meters away. They heard nothing. Not a rustle, not a snap, not a footfall. 4 armed men had moved 50 meters through dense jungle in complete silence. The tactical logic was brutal and irrefutable. American patrols moving at 2 kilometers per day created disturbances detectable from hundreds of meters away. Snapping branches, rustling leaves, subtle vibrations transmitted through root systems. Viet Cong listening posts were specifically trained to identify these signatures. A single broken twig could compromise an entire operation. At 100 meters per hour, no signature existed. The jungle soundscape recovered completely between movements. Birds kept singing. Insects kept droning. Monkeys continued their calls. To enemy listening posts, areas where Australians operated sounded perfectly normal. There was nothing to investigate, nothing to report, nothing to ambush. But slow movement provided more than concealment. It transformed the Australians from prey into apex predators. Moving at 100 meters per hour, they detected enemy activity long before being detected themselves. Viet Cong patrols moving at normal speeds created exactly the disturbances Australian troopers had trained to recognize. A patrol that had spent 4 hours listening could hear approaching enemies from extraordinary distances. The hunters became hunted without ever knowing it. This explained the impossible kill ratios. The Australians were not better marksmen or braver soldiers than Americans. They were invisible. They struck from positions no enemy expected and disappeared before effective response was possible. An American captain's after-action report from June 1968, later classified at the highest levels of command, captured the profound difference in methodology. He had accompanied a 5-man Australian SAS patrol into the northern approaches of the Longhai Mountains. What he witnessed over 72 hours fundamentally challenged everything he understood about conducting combat operations. The patrol departed Nui Dat at 0300 hours, moving on foot through 8 kilometers of rubber plantation before reaching the jungle fringe. The American immediately noted that the Australians moved differently than any unit he had served with. There was no talking, no hand signals, no sound whatsoever. The patrol leader communicated through a system of touches, shoulder for stop, arm for direction, hand signals so subtle the American observer missed half of them. By dawn, they had covered 12 kilometers and established a position overlooking a trail intersection that intelligence suggested served as a courier route for enemy forces. What happened next would form the centerpiece of the American captain's report. The Australians did not set up a conventional ambush. They did not dig fighting positions or establish clear fields of fire. Instead, 4 men melted into the undergrowth on either side of the trail, while the 5th moved forward to examine the path itself. For 20 minutes, this soldier studied the trail, occasionally lowering his face to within centimeters of the ground, sniffing the air, touching vegetation with his fingertips. When he returned, he communicated something to the patrol leader in a whisper so soft the American could not hear it, despite being less than 2 meters away. The patrol began repositioning with movement so slow they seemed almost geological in their patience. 11 hours later, a 3-man Viet Cong courier team walked directly into the ambush position. They never knew the Australians were there. The first indication of danger came when the lead courier stepped on a pressure-release detonator connected to a claymore mine. The entire engagement lasted 4 seconds, 3 enemy eliminated, 0 Australian casualties, 0 shots fired that could be heard beyond a 50-meter radius. But this was not what disturbed the American observer. What disturbed him came after. Standard American doctrine called for immediate extraction following contact with enemy forces. Get in, hit hard, get out before reinforcements arrived. The Australians operated under no such constraints. Following the ambush, the patrol remained in position for another 6 hours, watching the trail. At 14:30 hours, a second Viet Cong element arrived. A 7-man search team sent to investigate when the couriers failed to report. They found the bodies of their comrades arranged in a specific pattern that the American described as ritualistic. The 3 dead couriers had been positioned sitting upright against trees, their eyes open, their weapons placed across their laps as if they were resting. A playing card, the ace of spades, had been tucked into each man's collar. The psychological effect on the search team was immediate and visible. Even from 50 meters away, the American could see terror in their movements, the way they clustered together rather than spreading out, the frantic gestures as they attempted to comprehend what had happened. One soldier vomited. Another began firing blindly into the jungle, emptying his magazine at shadows. The Australians watched all of this. They did not engage. They simply observed as the Viet Cong collected their dead and retreated at twice the speed they had arrived, abandoning all pretense of tactical discipline. The American captain's report concluded with an observation that would echo through classified intelligence assessments for years. Australian SAS does not conduct ambushes. They conduct psychological warfare operations using enemy bodies as the primary medium of communication. Effectiveness unprecedented. Personal recommendation: I do not wish to participate in future joint operations. He had witnessed only the surface of Australian methodology. The true depth of their operational approach would become apparent when circumstances forced direct comparison between Australian and American tactics under combat conditions. The 173rd Airborne Brigade was among the most respected American units in Vietnam. The Sky Soldiers had earned reputation for aggressive competence through dozens of combat operations. When intelligence identified significant enemy activity in an area where both American and Australian forces were operating independently, the 173rd drew the mission. The company assigned numbered 118 paratroopers, commanded by a West Point captain on his second Vietnam tour. His soldiers were experienced veterans carrying the latest American equipment, maintaining standard American protocols. They moved like Americans. They smelled like Americans. They would fight like Americans. An Australian SAS patrol was operating independently in the same area. 4 men led by a sergeant with 3 Vietnam tours. They had been in the jungle for 6 days already, moving at their standard pace, gathering intelligence on enemy dispositions. They wore Ho Chi Minh sandals, they carried modified rifles, they had not bathed in 17 days. The two forces knew of each other, but had not coordinated operations. The American captain saw no reason to. His company would handle the mission using proven American methods. What he did not know was that the Australian patrol had already found what his company was searching for. 4 days of patient movement had brought them within observation distance of a Viet Cong battalion headquarters. They had spent 31 hours in a single concealed position, watching, counting, documenting. They had identified over 200 enemy fighters. They had mapped defensive positions. They had noted the presence of command elements. They had observed ammunition distribution, meal preparation, sentry rotation schedules. They had reported this intelligence through Australian channels. Somewhere in the communication system, the information was lost, delayed, or dismissed as insufficiently verified. The American company walked into the area blind. They were approaching a reinforced enemy position with 10 times their numbers and had no idea. The Viet Cong heard them coming from over 300 meters away. The enemy battalion commander had nearly 30 minutes to prepare his reception. The ambush detonated at 11:47 hours. Textbook L-shaped killing zone. Enemy fighters positioned along 2 converging axes opened fire simultaneously with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. 23 American soldiers fell in the first 20 seconds. The captain survived because he was positioned in the formation center rather than at point. He immediately implemented the response his training prescribed: return fire toward identified positions, call for artillery support, request helicopter gunships, organize survivors into defensive perimeter. Everything happened exactly as doctrine specified. Artillery rounds began impacting within 8 minutes. Gunships arrived within 15 minutes. The full weight of American firepower was directed at enemy positions. None of it was working. The Viet Cong were in prepared fighting positions, constructed and camouflaged over weeks. They had survived American artillery for years and knew exactly how to endure it. When barrages came, they stayed low in holes designed to withstand near misses. When gunships appeared, they used jungle canopy for concealment and shifted positions through covered trenches. The Americans could not see their enemy. They were shooting at muzzle flashes and suspected locations, expending ammunition against targets they could not verify. The enemy could see them perfectly. Every few minutes, another American soldier fell to precise fire from invisible positions. By 12:30 hours, the American company had suffered over 40 casualties. Ammunition was running low. The artillery had cratered hundreds of square meters of jungle without hitting a single confirmed enemy position. The gunships had expended most of their ordnance against shadows. The captain recognized his company was being systematically dismantled by an enemy his firepower could not touch. At 12:51 hours, he made the most humiliating radio call of his career. He requested assistance from the Australian SAS patrol he had declined to coordinate with 6 days earlier. The Australian sergeant leading the patrol received the transmission and understood immediately what it meant. Allied soldiers were dying less than 2 kilometers away. He could hear the firefight. He could monitor the increasingly desperate radio traffic. He could calculate approximately how long the American company could survive at current attrition rates. Standard Australian doctrine mandated avoiding decisive engagement. Inserting into an active firefight contradicted every principle of their methodology. 4 men against a reinforced battalion was suicide by any conventional analysis, but men were dying while he listened to their radio traffic. The sergeant made his decision in under a minute. His patrol would assist, but they would do it the Australian way. When the American captain learned that Australian reinforcement was moving toward him at 100 meters per hour, his response was volcanic. His men were dying in real time. Help was less than 2 kilometers away, and that help was apparently moving through the jungle at a pace that would arrive sometime next week. He demanded the Australians move faster. The sergeant refused. He explained briefly that faster movement would result in detection, and detected reinforcement would simply add Australian casualties to the American total without changing outcome. The captain would have to hold with what he had until the Australians reached a position where they could actually make a difference. The next 93 minutes were the longest of the American captain's military career. What he could not see was what the Australians were actually doing. The patrol was not moving toward the American position. They were moving into the enemy position, through it. Using the firefight's noise as auditory cover, using their scent discipline to avoid detection, 4 Australian soldiers were infiltrating directly through the Viet Cong rear area. The movement demanded absolute mastery of every skill their training had developed. They passed within meters of enemy fighters focused entirely on the American target to their front. They navigated through a battalion-sized engagement without creating any disturbance that might alert the enemy to their presence. At one point, an enemy fighter moved to within arm's reach of the sergeant's position while adjusting his equipment. The Australian remained frozen as the Viet Cong soldier checked his ammunition and returned to his fighting position. The enemy never knew that death had been one trigger pull away. At 14:27 hours, the Australian patrol reached a position no American tactical planner would have believed achievable. They were inside the Viet Cong perimeter, 35 meters from the enemy command post, surrounded by over 200 fighters who had no idea they were there. The sergeant began transmitting artillery corrections. These were not the broad area adjustments that had accomplished nothing for 2 hours. These were precision coordinates specifying individual targets with accuracy measured in meters. He could see exactly where the command element was directing the battle. He could see the machine gun positions causing the heaviest American casualties. He could see the ammunition distribution points, the reinforcement routes, the prepared withdrawal paths. The first corrected artillery mission landed directly on the Viet Cong command post. The battalion commander and his staff ceased to exist in a single devastating impact. Command and control collapsed instantly. The second correction eliminated a heavy machine gun position responsible for roughly 40% of American casualties. The gun went silent permanently. The third correction sealed the primary enemy withdrawal route. Viet Cong fighters attempting to disengage were caught in killing zones by artillery that seemed to know their plans before execution. Within 18 minutes, the battle reversed completely. The force that had been methodically destroying an American company was now being eliminated with surgical precision. Positions that had been invisible to American observers were targeted with impossible accuracy. Escape routes were sealed before they could be used. The surviving Viet Cong broke and fled, leaving equipment, wounded, and organizational coherence behind. The American company, which had faced annihilation, was able to consolidate and prepare for extraction. Final count: 34 Americans killed, 51 wounded out of 118 engaged. Viet Cong losses estimated at 87 killed with unknown additional casualties. The Australian patrol that had infiltrated the enemy perimeter and called precision fires from inside their lines suffered 0 casualties. The after-action reports were classified at the highest levels, not for operational security, for institutional protection. 4 Australians, using what American observers considered primitive methods, had accomplished what 118 elite American paratroopers with massive fire support could not. This was not information the Pentagon wanted circulating, but evidence kept accumulating from a source that could not be dismissed or classified: the enemy themselves. Documents captured in late 1968 revealed that the Viet Cong had developed completely different tactical guidance for engaging Australian versus American forces. For Americans, the guidance emphasized predictability and vulnerability. American units used helicopter insertion, creating detectable noise signatures from kilometers away. American patrols moved at trackable speeds, leaving clear trails. American soldiers could be smelled from 500 meters. American doctrine favored immediate escalation to heavy supporting fires, which created exploitable patterns. Recommended approach for engaging Americans: aggressive ambush at carefully selected locations. Inflict maximum casualties in the first 30 seconds. Withdraw through prepared routes before artillery becomes effective. Reposition for subsequent engagements. For Australians, the guidance was radically different. Australian patrols were acknowledged as extremely difficult to detect. They could not be smelled because they eliminated chemical signatures. They could not be heard because they moved too slowly to create sound. They could not be tracked visually because their counter-tracking techniques made trail following impossible. Their movement patterns were unpredictable. Their patience exceeded anything other Western forces had demonstrated. Recommended approach for Australians: avoidance. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Do not attempt ambush, because Australians were more likely to detect the trap before entering it than to walk into it unknowingly. Do not attempt pursuit, because Australian counter-tracking capabilities made such efforts futile and potentially fatal. If contact was unavoidable, break it off as quickly as possible and withdraw to areas where Australian patrols were not operating. The documents used a specific term for Australian soldiers that was applied to no other Allied force: Ma Rung, Vietnamese for jungle ghosts. The term carried supernatural connotations exceeding ordinary military respect. The Viet Cong were not merely cautious about Australian forces. They were afraid in ways they were never afraid of Americans. This fear had measurable tactical consequences. Enemy activity in Phuoc Tuy Province, where Australian forces concentrated, was consistently lower than in adjacent American-controlled sectors. Viet Cong units that aggressively engaged American forces in one area refused to enter Australian territory in the neighboring sector. American commanders noticed this disparity and demanded explanations. Perhaps the Australians were in less strategically important areas. Perhaps they were avoiding contact to keep casualty figures low. Perhaps they were falsifying operational reports. The captured documents eliminated every alternative explanation. The enemy was explicitly instructing its forces to avoid Australian contact because Australians were more dangerous. Why? What created this fundamental difference between two Allied forces equipped with similar weapons, facing the same enemy in the same terrain? The answer went deeper than tactical technique. It went to the roots of how each military culture understood warfare itself. American military doctrine emerged from the tradition of industrial warfare, wars won through superior production capacity, technological advantage, and overwhelming application of force. This tradition produced spectacular victories against conventional enemies: Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, the Chinese and North Korean armies in Korea. Each was defeated through superior firepower systematically applied until enemy capability to resist was destroyed. This approach worked brilliantly when the enemy cooperated by massing forces, defending territory, and engaging in battles where firepower advantage mattered. It worked less well when the enemy refused to cooperate, when they dispersed rather than massed, when they attacked and withdrew rather than defending fixed positions, when they made firepower advantage irrelevant by fighting at ranges where technology couldn't be brought to bear. Australian doctrine emerged from fundamentally different historical experiences. A century of fighting colonial wars with limited resources against enemies who couldn't be defeated through firepower alone. The Boer War taught that conventional tactics failed against guerrillas who knew the terrain and chose their battles carefully. The Malayan Emergency taught that patience and intelligence gathering achieved better results than search and destroy sweeps. The Indonesian confrontation taught that small, highly trained units operating independently could accomplish missions that brigade-sized forces couldn't. Most critically, Australian forces had just spent years fighting communist insurgents in Malaysian jungles that were remarkably similar to Vietnam. They arrived in Southeast Asia with recent practical experience in exactly the kind of warfare now required. American forces arrived with doctrine developed for conventional warfare and assumptions about firepower supremacy that guerrilla warfare rendered obsolete. But there was something else, something that American observers struggled to articulate. The Australians seemed to approach jungle warfare with a different emotional register entirely. Where American soldiers often displayed anxiety, frustration, or fear in the bush, Australian SAS operators appeared almost comfortable. They moved through triple canopy jungle the way a farmer moves through his own property, with familiarity, confidence, and an almost proprietary sense of ownership. The American captain who witnessed Australian operations in June 1968 attempted to capture this difference in his final report. He wrote that true mastery of jungle warfare required becoming something other than a conventional soldier. The jungle was not the enemy's weapon. It could be yours if you were willing to transform yourself into something the jungle would accept as belonging there. This was the revelation that American Special Operations would spend decades attempting to replicate with mixed success. The transformation of Australians into what the enemy called jungle ghosts did not happen by accident. It was the product of a selection and training process so brutal that American observers who witnessed it recommended against attempting replication in U.S. forces. Australian SAS selection began not with physical tests, but with psychological evaluation. Candidates were assessed for specific personality profiles: high pain tolerance, low need for social validation, above-average pattern recognition, and what psychologists termed predatory patience. The ability to remain motionless for hours while maintaining complete situational awareness, the willingness to act with explosive violence after extended periods of inactivity, the capacity to function independently in environments where help was days away. Only 1 in 12 candidates who began selection completed it. Those who passed entered a training program that lasted 18 months, 3 times longer than U.S. Army Special Forces training of the same era, and a significant portion of that training took place not in jungle warfare schools, but in the Australian outback, learning tracking techniques from Aboriginal instructors whose methods had never been written down because they had been passed down orally for 40,000 years. Aboriginal Australians had survived in some of the most demanding wilderness environments on Earth through accumulated knowledge of concealment, tracking, patient hunting, and environmental awareness. This knowledge represented the longest continuous tradition of such skills anywhere in human history. Techniques that worked survived because practitioners survived. Techniques that failed eliminated their practitioners before they could pass anything down. The result was a body of wilderness knowledge that no modern training program could replicate from scratch. Aboriginal trackers could determine from a footprint not just direction of travel, but approximate weight, whether the person was carrying a load, whether they were injured, how long ago they had passed, and often whether they were alert or relaxed when they made the track. They could read broken vegetation the way literate people read books. They could detect presence through absence, noticing when birds had stopped calling or insects had gone silent in ways that indicated human intrusion. Australian SAS incorporated specific elements from this tradition into their operational methodology. The concept of becoming part of the environment rather than moving through it as a foreign element. The practice of reading landscape features for information about recent activity. The discipline of absolute stillness that permitted observation without detection. The patience that could sustain focused attention for hours without the restlessness that Western training struggled to eliminate. American military culture had no equivalent foundation. American doctrine emphasized action, speed, and technology overcoming environment. The idea that patience might outperform aggression, that stillness might outperform movement, that adaptation might outperform force, was philosophically alien to institutions built on fundamentally different assumptions. This cultural gap produced tactical disparities that casualties measured, but statistics alone could not explain. American patrols moved fast because American culture valued speed and action. Australian patrols moved slow because their training proved speed was frequently fatal. Americans maintained hygiene because their culture associated cleanliness with professionalism and discipline. Australians abandoned hygiene because their training proved cleanliness was a detectable liability. The tragedy was that lessons were available for learning. The Australians shared information freely with American counterparts. Individual Americans recognized value in Australian methods and advocated adoption. The evidence was overwhelming and accessible to anyone willing to examine it. But institutions do not change because evidence demands change. They change when the cost of not changing becomes unbearable. For the American military in Vietnam, the cost was distributed across thousands of individual casualties rather than concentrated in a single catastrophic event that might have forced immediate reform. Each ambush was a separate incident. Each detected patrol was an individual failure that could be attributed to specific circumstances rather than systematic flaws. The pattern was visible only in aggregate statistics that senior commanders had professional reasons not to examine closely. By the end of 1971, when the last Australian combat troops departed Vietnam, the record was undeniable. Australian SAS had conducted approximately 1,200 combat patrols. They had achieved kill ratios estimated between 17-1 and as high as 30-1, depending on the source. They had suffered 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness. 28 wounded in action. They had killed approximately 600 enemy troops verified, with estimates suggesting significantly higher actual totals. These statistics represented not just tactical success, but a completely different paradigm of how jungle warfare could be fought. The final American assessment of Australian SAS operations would not be completed until 1974, 3 years after the last Australian combat troops departed. Classified top secret and distributed to fewer than 50 recipients, the report reached conclusions that contradicted everything American military doctrine had assumed about counterinsurgency warfare. First, small unit operations conducted by highly trained personnel achieved better results than large unit operations supported by overwhelming firepower. Second, Indigenous tracking methods provided intelligence capabilities that no technological system could replicate. Proposals to recruit Native American trackers for similar programs were submitted but never implemented. Third, psychological warfare operations targeting enemy morale could achieve strategic effects disproportionate to resources invested. A single 5-man patrol operating for 2 weeks could degrade enemy effectiveness more than a battalion-sized sweep and clear operation. Fourth, and most controversially, Australian methods achieved these results while operating under significantly fewer restrictions than American forces. The classified annex noted that certain Australian practices regarding treatment of enemy dead and conduct of psychological operations would likely violate standing directives if conducted by U.S. personnel. This final point would ensure that the report remained classified for decades. The Pentagon had no interest in publicizing that their most effective allies in Vietnam had succeeded partly by doing things American forces were prohibited from doing. Better to let the Australian contribution fade into historical obscurity, remembered only by the veterans who had served alongside them. But history has a way of preserving what authorities wish to forget. In the decades following the Vietnam War, fragments of the Australian SAS story began emerging through veteran memoirs, declassified documents, and academic research. Today, special operations forces around the world study Australian SAS methods from Vietnam as examples of unconventional warfare at its most effective. The tracker programs, the psychological operations, the long-range patrol doctrine, all have been incorporated into modern special forces training. What was once classified as too controversial to acknowledge has become standard curriculum. Yet, something has been lost in translation. Modern special operations can replicate Australian tactics. They struggle to replicate Australian psychology. The transformation that turns conventional soldiers into something the jungle accepts as its own. The willingness to become what the environment demands rather than demanding the environment accommodate what you prefer to be. The acceptance that effective hunting requires becoming a hunter in your soul, not merely in your training. The American captain who made that desperate radio call begging for help from soldiers he had mocked days earlier survived the war. He spent his remaining months in country seeking out Australian personnel, asking questions, observing training, trying to understand what had happened and why his doctrine had failed so completely. He learned that his company had walked into that ambush smelling like a department store. He learned that his patrol speed had announced presence to every enemy listening post within a kilometer. He learned that every assumption underlying his tactical approach had been wrong for the environment where he was operating. He also learned that the men who saved him had been dismissed as primitives by American colleagues, that their methods had been mocked as cowardice or incompetence, that the evidence of their success had been classified and buried because it embarrassed institutions that preferred comfortable failure to uncomfortable learning. He left the Army in 1970. He never spoke publicly about what happened. The records remained classified for decades, but he remembered. He remembered the men who fell because American doctrine put them in positions that Australian doctrine would have avoided. The radio call begging for help from soldiers he had declined to coordinate with. The 93 minutes watching his command disintegrate while help crawled toward him at 100 meters per hour. He remembered the moment when 4 men who smelled like death emerged from the jungle, having walked through an enemy battalion without detection. The moment when artillery that had been useless for hours suddenly began landing with surgical precision on targets he could not see. The moment when he understood that everything he thought he knew about warfare was wrong. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. The Pentagon called their methods primitive. The soldiers who survived because of them called them something else entirely. They called them the reason they were still alive. 1 to 500. That was not luck, not favorable terrain, not statistical anomaly. That was what happened when soldiers stopped fighting the jungle and started becoming part of it, when they stopped moving like Americans and started moving like shadows, when they stopped fighting like conventional forces and started fighting like ghosts. The Pentagon knew the numbers. They classified them. The enemy knew the numbers. They feared them. The survivors knew the numbers. They owed their lives to them. The arithmetic of patience over firepower, the mathematics of adaptation over technology, the calculus of becoming what the jungle required rather than demanding the jungle accommodate what you preferred to be. 50 years later, the lessons remain relevant. Every new conflict produces variations on the same fundamental theme: technological overconfidence meeting environmental reality. Institutional assumptions colliding with conditions those assumptions cannot address. The expensive way failing, while the simple way succeeds. The Australians solved the problem in 1966. The Americans took decades to learn from their solution. Some would argue they still have not fully learned. Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts, the soldiers who were dismissed as primitives until they proved themselves masters, the ghosts who saved the men who mocked them. That is their legacy. That is what they proved. That is what they left behind for anyone willing to learn. The question has always been whether those who need the lessons most will ever be willing to accept them. The Australians answered that question more than 50 years ago in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy Province. The institutions that ignored them are still formulating their response.